Hello, I'm WP Swazer and I'm here to talk about aggregate supply and demand basics. I once worked with a fellow who started teaching economics right after the Kennedy assassination, so that gives you an idea of the breadth of his experience. And he taught aggregate supply and demand right after regular supply and demand, or market supply and demand. And supply and demand is usually the second or third chapter. So he did that because they have strong similarities. However, I will say this, doing the job now for over 20 full-time years, aggregate supply and demand is the first topic I look at when reviewing a book. Some of the worst problems can be in this topic. So, with supply and demand, this was price. Now it will be prices. So, whenever we have a downward movement on the Y or vertical axis, that means deflation, which happens often in this graph and doesn't happen often in reality. Well, let me say this. A deflation has not happened often in the 20th century, but it did happen often in the 1800s. So perhaps you can live with it that way. I've seen some books put price change here. That's more realistic in terms of increasing inflation or decreasing inflation, but it rules out inflation, and inflation is, it rules out deflation. Deflation is not possible in this first quadrant. With price change, deflation happens down here in the negative y-axis or negative vertical axis. So we'll call it price level or prices. Here, instead of quantity, we have quantities. The quantities of goods and services, inventories. It could also be called GDP sub R, or real GDP. If we call it nominal GDP, we get the two axes tangled. Because if this one includes price change, we have price change here. We don't have the axes separated. So this is actual inventory of goods and services. This is price level. This is still origin. Demand. Aggregate demand looks like regular demand. It behaves like regular demand. What drives aggregate demand? Aggregate demand is driven or determined by consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports. So those are the determinants driving aggregate demand. So if any of those components increase, aggregate demand goes away from zero. If any of those decline, aggregate demand moves closer to origin or zero. Now, aggregate supply, or we could call this SRAS, but I won't. I'll just simply call it, instead of supply, I call it aggregate supply. And aggregate supply is a function of wage and energy prices. Wage and energy prices and productivity. What inventions do we have? What laws or deregulation do we have? I know for a while the bodies governing taxi cabs were against Uber and Lyft. The bodies supervising hospitality in hotels were against Airbnb. And eventually, those internet companies prevailed, which would be depicted like this. Aggregate supply moving to the right, further away from zero with greater productivity. If we have a wage decline, which to Keynes is impossible, that also would cause aggregate supply to move to the right. A better example would be falling energy prices. What happens is we get an energy panic. Prices are speculated up, and then all this capacity months later comes into play and drives down energy prices. And cheaper energy is depicted like this. So here's our current GDP, and here's our current price level. Always starting price level at 100. Let's say current GDP is 20. If a minimum wage law is passed, or if workers gain more rights, if the Amazon drivers were to unionize, say they're unionized by the Teamsters, you'd get something like this. Aggregate supply prime, and we would have less GDP being supplied and at a higher price. Okay. If we were to have something affect aggregate demand, let's say the tax laws are revamped to make depreciation and investment more difficult. If that were to happen, if investment were to fall, one of the aggregate demand components, we'd have something like this. So we have an AD prime here, and a smaller GDP, but this time at lesser prices. Okay. Speaking of all the inventions, all the productivity, I was watching my son play a video game, and in it there was this fellow describing a new clean energy source. Or better than that, look at all these solar panels being mounted on roofs. If that continues, if there's more gains with that, cheap energy, small utility bills, or whatever resources the utilities use are now being freed up for something else with solar panels. We get a productivity boom. We have more GDP and with lesser prices. Finally, if we have an aggregate demand boom, and what could cause that? Well, let's say the government becomes very active, very Keynesian, and introduces some spending bills. If the government introduces some new purchases, we'll get aggregate demand prime moving northeasterly. We will have more output, but more demand for resources will bid up prices. So this is just the basics of aggregate supply and demand. We only have one supply curve right here, aggregate supply. Many books make a distinction between short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. Now, long-run aggregate supply can be a point or a vertical curve, and the reason why we have these two is because when current equilibrium is beyond LRAS, we have inflation building, and if current equilibrium is inside or to the left of LRAS, then we have unemployment building as prices fall. But we don't have that complexity with this simple introduction. In simple, I hope it was. Thank you for watching.